I guess we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you.
To be fair, we didn't say you had to, but we appreciate it. So, welcome everyone. Congrats, you made it. Last session of the day at Summit. So, yeah. I'm James Hall, the Director of Engineering at the Louisiana Office of Technology Services. I'm joined here with Israel Duke, our lead UI UX designer, and Keisha Perkins, a senior UI UX developer on our team. And we're going to walk you through how Louisiana is rethinking the way that we're building and delivering software. And it's, shocker, it's more than just about writing code. It's, transforming how people experience government services. So, quick background, Louisiana's got a consolidated IT department. So the Office of Technology Services, overnight, about 12 years ago, took 16 large agencies, which I think equates to about 30 or so offices and various things, and we became one IT department overnight. So everybody's technology became our problem, and we've been untangling it ever since. So, all right, buttons work. So, government technology has challenges. I'd say they're not entirely unique, but we've kind of grouped ours into three categories here. Legacy systems, which I'm sure nobody else has that problem. Accessibility, and then efficiency and cost we kind of group together. So legacy systems, they're everywhere. They're not only old, but they're brittle, hard to change, and even harder to maintain. Accessibility is generally treated as a checkbox at the end, and we're trying to recenter that as a core requirement for everything we're doing. And then cost and efficiency, like I said, 16 agencies, shared resources, so always trying to balance those priorities. And so we'll kind of touch on each of these themes throughout today's talk. So I think a lot of us have read this book if you come to these conferences, Recoding America by Jennifer Paulka. When I was reading this one, this quote stuck out to me. And for me, legacy systems always meant, coming from a developer's background, things you're scared to change. And I think that does apply here, but the full quote was, when we speak of legacy systems in government, it does not simply mean that they are old. It means that we're grappling with the legacy of decades of competing interests, power struggles, creative workarounds, and make-dos that are opportune at the time, but unmanageable in the long run. I think everybody can probably feel that pain. So when we're talking about modernization, we're talking about changing not just the technology, but the culture and the delivery model behind it. So for us, our goal was to improve service delivery, apply standards at scale, and ensure that equity is baked in, not just for today's systems, but for everything we do going forward. We want people interacting with government to feel like they're using a well-designed product and not struggling through a bureaucracy. Strategy. We broke it down into, well, 3 strategies here. Simplify and standardize. So tackling that sprawl that came from merging 16 IT departments into one. As you can imagine, 16 IT departments all had different ways of doing it. So we're talking some that were using COBOL, some that were using .NET, some in Java, classic ASP, lots of Lotus notes. And so trying to align on a common tech stack to reduce duplication, improve support, and make it easier to build and maintain. If we've got 300 or so programmers on staff supporting all of these different agencies, but if I've got pockets that can only do COBOL, they can't go help another agency that's primarily baked in Java. So trying to standardize that tech stack as we modernize so that we can share those resources more efficiently. Accessible first design, working with, not just for the people that use our systems. And then collaboration, building these shared platforms and reusable design patterns across all of our agencies. Our governor came in with a one-team vision, and for us that's bringing together the designers, the developers, analysts, the business area experts, and our operations staff to work collaboratively from day one on our projects. All right, so we've laid out the strategy, and I want to walk through 3 case studies, or we are going to walk through 3 case studies, I should say. Each one kind of posed some unique challenges for us. Not all of them had a perfect outcome, but offered real lessons and measurable impact for us. So we'll start with our efforts to modernize a decades-old mainframe system for the Office of Motor Vehicles. And that project didn't reach the finish line, but we learned a lot, delivered a lot of tools that the agency still uses, and it kind of shaped the way we're doing things going forward. Next, we're going to talk about how we rebuilt a case management system that supports some of our most vulnerable residents, with a focus on better data, accessibility, and field usability. And then finally, looking at how the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries is unifying some siloed digital systems to improve data quality and operational efficiency. So these case studies show how modernization for us isn't about perfection, it's about progress, adaptability, and learning as you go. So we'll start with the Office of Motor Vehicles. This one's near and dear to my heart. So this came from an effort to modernize a core set of services that most people in the state are going to interact with: driver's license, vehicle registration, and driver management. And they're running on a mainframe that, I guess when we started on the project, it was 40 years old, which we were carbon dating based on that. The oldest comment we found from a programmer that they wrote a date on, and so that's about as good as we could get it, Thank you, programmers, for leaving that for us. So it's probably, in its 50s now, but it's incredibly powerful and incredibly rigid. Very difficult to train new staff on, and even harder to change. So this is a lovely screenshot of what it looks like, thanks to the test data, which, as you can imagine, is baked into the production system, but we have them there. So the technology at OMV, and I touched on the mainframe, it's not just old, it's kind of an archive of every tech era since the 80s. The mainframe itself powers those 3 main systems: the driver's license, driver management, and vehicle registration. But orbiting around that are legacy apps written in everything from Lotus Notes to classic ASP. Something else called Mapper, which when I started I was convinced was something that they made up. It's a very powerful system, like I said, but training someone to use it takes years. Each of those 3 main systems in it took 6 months to a year, to train somebody. Driver management, I think, was at least a year, if not a year and a half, to train somebody just how to use it and be able to take calls. And typically, the people who are working at the O&D in those front office are, some of our lower paying jobs. There's a lot of high turnover, so training somebody for a year for them to leave, sometimes before they even finish training, is not ideal. It's also something we couldn't just rip and replace. So, how do you start modernizing something this big without grinding everything to a halt? Because this is probably one of those agencies where anytime anything goes wrong, it's in the news, sometimes before you even know it went wrong. So we started smart, I think, and we started small. So we started with some of those ancillary systems, primarily the parish tax table, office listings, those things that were built in Lotus Notes and ASP. Just in case you aren't aware, what you might call counties, we call parishes. So the parish tax table is basically just how you calculate taxes on any transaction and how that money gets distributed out to all the various municipalities where you might have registered your vehicle, bought it, anything like that. So our goal there was to start to introduce agile concepts, build trust. I think we've heard a number of times this week, and prove that this kind of work could actually deliver results. Our team was very lean in the beginning. The joke was we had a Scrum team. It was 4 developers, 2 BAs, and a Scrum Master, who I think was also our subject matter expert. We had a lot of stumbles right out of the gate. First agile project, first major modernization project, trying to figure out what we're doing as we go along. We got the Scrum guy, we started looking at it, tried to get everybody on board, and as you can imagine, didn't work great. But eventually we started to deliver results, and as we did, we got more buy-in. The team grew ultimately, I think, to 2 or 3 teams working and delivering. We got that initial foundation of some of those ancillary systems, and then they told us to pivot and start tackling driver management. That was the one that took a year and a half to train somebody on. So driver management is how you go about reinstating suspended licenses. Somebody gets fines, violations, things like that, license gets suspended. Going through that process to get it reinstated so that you can drive and not get in trouble if you get pulled over. And so what ended up happening at OMB is only a small portion of the people could actually work this system. They were all located in the main office, so you can imagine if you had to go into an office in North Louisiana and to get reinstatement, you go wait in line, finally get to the front of the line, and now you need to go sit at this desk, and they give you a phone, and you're going to call the main office, and you might get put on hold, because there's only a few people who can actually work that system. Yeah, it's great UI UX. So, what we ultimately built was a modern web interface that just wrote back and forth to that mainframe system. It let us deliver results really quickly. This is actually the exact same record I showed in the previous slide from the mainframe. And it was very intuitive for these, for the staff. So anybody at OMB could actually start taking calls, and ultimately that's what they did to start processing payments and collecting money, because this is a self-funded agency. So everybody in the OMB was able to take these calls, process them, get them moving quicker, and the training for it was maybe an hour or 2, and they were good to go. So it was a clear and measurable win for us that showed what modernization could look like, and we finally got the backing that we were looking for and ready to rock and roll. But in government, administrations change and priorities change, and there were a lot of I'll say maybe misconceptions about how we were approaching it. There was a big idea being floated around that, we're just building modern interfaces on top of the mainframe. It's like, no, that's what we did to solve a problem and get a win. But the ultimate goal was to get rid of that mainframe long term. So And ultimately, the project was running longer than expected, a number of restarts. And so it was decided this year to scrap the project. We're gonna go buy something from a rather large vendor that's done this in several states. So we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, all the things that we build are still running. They're still supporting the agency. They're still able to process things a lot faster. And I'm sure some of the ancillary pieces that aren't going to be in this vendor's off-the-shelf system, hey, they'll still be there. We also learned for ourselves a lot about how we approach agile software delivery. A lot about how to market better. Making sure that people understand, hey, this is what we're doing. These are the next steps. Here's the next win that you can expect to come. Learning, how to better engage those customers along the way. A lot about doing more with less. And how ultimately, whenever we're going into another project, these are the red flags that we learned from this one. Not having dedicated product owners. Show of hands, who's had that problem, not having a lot of staff and not having access to the SMEs that we needed. But it also gave us a number of other wins. Coming out of this project, we got a design system. That was kind of an unexpected win, but this was our first major modernization effort. We hired a designer, sitting there, and we started building out the components for the system. And as we started to get some wins, the next project started up and the next one. So it's like, okay, let's just start sharing what we did, and then we turned that into a design system. I think if we had been told to sit down and build a design system, we probably would have had all our resources taken away before we ever got it done. But having it being a part of a project that was ongoing made it much easier. Everybody was able to see how that could win, and now we've got I'd say a pretty high adoption rate for all of our new projects going forward, where everything just starts. We don't have to even fight about using our design system. So great win for us there. Thank you. And then just one more thing on this one. So during the course of this project, living in Louisiana, we deal with these things called hurricanes. And Hurricane Laura hit during 2020. It was tied to the strongest hurricane on record to make landfall in Louisiana. We had 4 hit in Louisiana that year. Normally, after a hurricane hits, we jump in, do DSNAP. And that's usually within 2 weeks to a month after a hurricane hits, we're standing up DSNAP. That normally looks like a big tent with tables, laptops. We're issuing benefits right there on the spot, but we couldn't do that this year. So we had about 2 weeks to figure out how to do it virtually. And due to all the teams that we had already working with OMB, we had our mobile driver's license app, first in the country to do that, and thankfully it was there. We were able to actually verify identity either over the phone or through that app and build it in those 2 weeks because of what we had done already with this team. So a huge win there, and able to identify people remotely and get those benefits out to them. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand it over to Keisha Perkins to talk about our Elderly Protective Services Case Management System. It's a mouthful.
Hello, as he said, I'm Keisha Perkins. I am a senior UX developer for the Office of Technology Services, and I'm going to be doing a not too deep dive on the Governor's Office of Elderly Protective Services case management system, and as he said, it is a mouthful. So first, I want to talk about EPS as an agency. This is a crisis management agency that handles reports of any elder abuse in the state. And because this is a crisis management agency, they had a need for very fast workflow with very tight deadlines. There were some situations where they would have 24 hours to have visited a client's domicile, or they would run into legal issues. So this is an agency that needed us to be able to create something for them that would be very streamlined, work very well, be very robust, so that they could handle the workload that they were doing. And the persona that we initially worked on was that these are users who are not the most computer savvy, but a little bit higher aptitude than your average user, because they had an existing system. Their system was 25 years old, but it was very young in terms of government apps. It was not a mainframe. Their workflow goes like this. You receive a report, someone calls in, someone writes in, and they say, I have witnessed a situation of elder abuse. And so an intake worker will take that in, and there is a quick decision, well, not a full decision, but that case can either be accepted or not accepted. So if the case is accepted, it is then assigned to a worker in the state and in that region. And that investigator is assigned, and they will go and they will investigate, visit the accused, visit the client, visit that person's caregivers, the collaterals who have other information about it. And then they will report on it. And so that cycle of investigation and reporting, it keeps going until they feel they have come to a conclusion, and then that case is closed. And when I say closed, I don't mean like it's done, never talk to me again. I mean, there's a record that is kept, and then sometimes these cases get subpoenaed in court. So they also needed us to make something that was going to be robust enough to be admissible in court. Now, if a case is not accepted, it is either rejected outright or referred. So a rejected case is one that just does not meet the criteria at all for a case of abuse or anything having to do with that agency. Maybe you're reporting a case of discrimination, and you need to be reporting to Louisiana Commission on Human Rights as opposed to Elder Protective Services. But then one that is referred is one that it meets the criteria but not quite. So maybe this is an adult being abused, a child, as opposed to an elder. So those get referred to DCFS or an appropriate agency. And then a report is written, and the case is closed in much the same way. So I'm going to talk about the way that we built this application out in a problem-solution structure. So first, we want to talk about the pain points, and they can kind of be summed up pretty succinctly. Let's talk about the first category of pain points. Data management and tracking. Users told us that there was no historical data. If someone went into an account and changed something, there was no record of that change. There was no record of what that used to be. I'm sure we all work in government. We know how that is a major issue. There were limited data types. So when I say, you have a client, there's been a report of abuse, but there may be multiple reporters. This client might have multiple caregivers or multiple decision makers in their life. And what was happening is once you had that first reporter or that first caregiver, there was no place to add a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth. And so everything would just get kind of pushed in the same bucket. And now you're having to comb through this same bucket to figure out who is a reporter, who is a caregiver. And then there was no real data validation. All the validation was saying was that every blank needed to be filled in. And so that creates a situation where I need to work this case, I need to get to the next screen, but I don't have this client's social security number. So I'm just gonna put a bunch of nines in the input, and then who knows if I'll come back and change that. So the data is now inaccurate, it's incomplete, and overall, this is just an outdated system that was built for a different time and a different set of capabilities. And so our solution strategies were we first created an audit log and an activity log. And what that audit log did was every interaction with a piece of information was timestamped, logged. You knew who did it, you knew why they did it. If they changed the phone number from 555 to 556, that is timestamped and that is documented. And in that way, it's not only historical data, so I can go in and see that that phone number was changed, but I also can see that the phone number was deleted, the witness was deleted. And so now this is not just a historical tool, this is an accountability tool, because I can see where my agency workers are handling the case, how they are handling the case, how frequently they visit their reporters and things like that. And then the next thing we did was we rebuilt their databases from scratch. Our deputy CIO, he personally hand-picked through all of the database information, all of the incompletes, all of the 999s, and he made sure that it was going to migrate into their new systems and then we built out their tables. We gave them like an initial structure, but then we would be in constant contact with them, and they could say, well, actually, I need to be able to put this here as opposed to here. And so we could reshape the databases, we could reshape the tables and the columns and all of those things according to their needs. And at the end, we got something that was true to the workflow that they were doing. And then we also built out a validation schema. So now we can be far more nuanced. We don't just say, you need to have this social security number, you need to have this date of birth. We say, you need to have this social security number to close this case, but maybe you need the date of birth to open it. And you don't need this piece of information unless this piece of information exists. So if you say that this is a high priority case, maybe now high priority cases need a little bit more information because they're more likely to be subpoenaed in court. And so we could add validations that were nuanced and situational and then didn't encourage behaviors like including incomplete or inaccurate information. And lastly, we built out a permission schema. And what's interesting about this agency is that people have roles, but they have multiple roles in different regions. So I might be a supervisor in Shreveport, Louisiana, but I am just an investigator in New Orleans. And so when I log into the system and I look at the case data, there are things that I should be able to see in Shreveport because I am a supervisor that I should not be able to see in New Orleans because I have a limited scope as an investigator in the region of New Orleans. And so we built out a permissions model that not only took in what roles the user had, but what role they were acting in that moment. And then when we built our audit log, we had to build it in such a way that says, when this person selects this drop down and changes from Shreveport to Monroe, that's going to log as a person logged out and a person logged in with a different location tenant. But what that now logs as, this person switched regions. And so all of these pieces kind of had to interlock and work together, and it was just a lot of moving pieces, and it was one of those things that going into the project we thought it would be very simple. It's a relatively small agency, but number of users does not have anything to do with complexity. And so by the end of it, we had built out a permission schema that from down to the CRUD operation, there are some buttons that don't appear if you're in this region, and there are some inputs that are no longer inputs. There, you can only read that data, and you can try to brute force it and send it through. But the API has the same permissions model applied to it too. So you're not going to be able to change data that you're not supposed to be able to change. And then on to our next category of issues: reporting and data insights. So our users needed paper and digital versions. We're in government, so we know that everybody needs wet signatures. We know that everybody needs to have rows and rows and rows of file storages for something that could take up a thumb drive. But we are in government, so we have to fit the client and their needs. And so these documents needed to be digital and they needed to be they needed to be on paper. And so now we have to print them. And printing is very difficult. I'm sure you've all experienced where you're looking at a web page, you click print, and that's not the web page I was looking at. It looks completely different. So that was an issue that we had to get around. We could generate PDFs, we can figure out all of these things, and we came up with a solution that tied into our design system. They needed more robust reports. So the legacy system had what were called detailed reports and simple reports. And one of the pain points in our original meetings was that there was really no difference between the two. And so if I wanted something more detailed, I would have to manually do that. And so this becomes tedious, and the managers, their director was spending an hour every week running these little emaciated reports they could run, and then transferring those into Excel, and then generating her reports about velocity and burn down and all of those things. And that's just a director does not need to be wasting their time doing that. And so our solutions, so our design system that James mentioned is called Pelican. Pelican is the state bird of Louisiana, and it's built on top of Bootstrap. And because we have this design system, we can just keep adding components, adding things as we need them. And so as I was trying to figure out the solution for printing, what we came up with was some CSS, just out of the box CSS that can override the print styles that the printer might decide needs to be applied, and say, this is what I want you to do on print. And I can talk at length about why that happens when you click print and now it's deciding that the piece of paper is the size of a cell phone. But we are able to have default behavior as well as explicit behavior about how a web page should be printed. And then we rebuilt their report generation. So now that we have these pages that can be printed and we can design exactly how a page should be printed, any page can become a report. And then there are also these cross-cutting reports that need to pull from this database table and that database table. And so we also built custom API endpoints that built out those reports and deliver them to the user. And then, of course, we replaced that manager's report. Now she clicks a button and it runs in seconds instead of hours. And so just able to take that load off of the workers. And then finally we have mobility and usability. So as I said, this is a 25-year-old application. And so it wasn't mobile friendly, but because this is a very person-to-person type of job to work, a lot of these people are in the field. They're visiting people, they need to take notes. And so what they had to do was print out a form, a separate form from the form that you see here, and write on it when they're visiting the clients, and then come back and input that information. So now we're doubling a task, and the transfer between paper and digital, that's an opportunity for data to be lost, data to be inaccurate. They also had limited and rigid search. So John Smith with an H would not hit for John Smith with no H. And because those fuzzy searches weren't working, you would maybe miss a pattern. Maybe this is someone who is a repeat offender, and just because that name got misspelled, you didn't catch it. So now users were telling us that they cannot search well, they cannot filter well. And then parts of the website, parts of the application were just broken. There was one report I was reviewing, and in the averages column, the dividend and the divisor were flipped, and so I was seeing numbers like 1,000%. And that now I can't use that report because none of these numbers are true, and even if there were one true number, how can I know which ones are true and which ones are not? So these items were those small things that produce the big win. And so our strategies for those were, because we have this Pelican design system, we can be mobile first. And so we can take a page that needed to be on the desktop and we can make it much more mobile friendly. We added full text search and filtering. And so now John Smith and John Smith are showing up together, and then a human can see if that's an actual pattern. But also, you can have multiple search criteria. Maybe I'm looking specifically for a reporter, someone who has reported a case of abuse who is named John Smith. So I don't need to see people who are accused of those situations to be returned here. And then not only did we add search, but we also added robust filtering. And the filtering was very important because I'm looking at a list of cases, and now I can say, give me every case between August 1st and August 21st that is in the city of Shreveport and has not been assigned to anyone and is of high priority and hasn't been opened in how many days. And so now I have a report like that. And so I have these little custom reports that are important to the way that I, as an individual, do my workflow. Because this filtering is passed through just a query stream, now you can have a bookmark of as many reports as you want without us having to go in and manually make reports for you. Because you might have need of something that we didn't foresee while we were building this application. And then we also did a lot of testing. So devs were responsible for making sure that all of our code worked. And then the other devs were responsible for making sure that our code worked. And then once it got pushed in, then QA gets their hands on it, and we send it to UAT. And then the users get to tell us this is terrible, change it, start again. And we get things like these buttons at the bottom of these screens. Those actually float. So no matter where you scroll on the page, those buttons are always available. And it's because they told us this is such a fast-paced thing. I won't have to scroll so far to get to these buttons. The actions need to always be available to me. And so just those small things that was literally one line of code made such a huge difference in the usability of the application. And so overall, our process was, we're looping through this and kind of iterating and molding it, and it's much more collaborative. And what we found was, because we're kind of building as we go, similar to what Jane said, we built a design system not because we wanted to build a design system, but because we needed a design system in the moment. And so there are components that have come out of this application that are just now a part of Pelican. And so I would say, if I could summarize the results of that application, it wouldn't be if it's not broke, don't fix it. It would be, if it works, fix a lot of other stuff with it. Because we got so much stuff out of just this application. And I'm done. And so now I am going to pass the report. You've got your own fancy to Israel. Israel too, our lead designer.
Thank you, Keisha. So I'm Israel Duke. I'm the lead UI and UX designer for Louisiana's Office of Technology Services, more specifically in the product delivery vertical. We have a lot of verticals, and we're the ones that get to make the cool stuff. So I want to tell you about my favorite project in the nearly 7 years that I've been serving Louisianians in this role. But to do that, I need to introduce to you the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Wildlife and Fisheries is tasked with protecting the sports person's paradise, the wildlife, the flora, everything that makes the ecological diversity of Louisiana rich. And we all want to live in a healthy world, and I'm quite sure you don't often hear about how glowing screens can actually support the environment. I'll tell you a little bit about that too. Some of their first problems, we'll talk about 3 problems that we saw, 3 lessons that we learned from our earlier projects and our failures. Our first one is that enterprise level cohesion requires vigilance. How many of you work for government? How many of you have worked with vendors that you felt didn't give a damn? We're in good company. Well, we work for the government, and we know, as James has said, we have a 50-year-old database, we have a 25-year-old system. whatever is built for the government stays around forever. When I worked in the private sector, whatever I built was deleted a year later. We have to live with what we build. I have classes. This is assistive technology. If I retire with the government, I'll need more assistive technology. When we're working with the vendors for wildlife and fisheries, and right now what we're doing for them is a modernization project where we're rebuilding many of their systems that are siloed, don't talk to each other, have duplicated kind of overlapping and data that doesn't really talk. The scale of this project means we have to work with several vendors. And working with several vendors is like herding cats, and I know we've seen that commercial. Well, each vendor has its own agenda. They want to get in and get out as soon as possible. They're not necessarily going to care about accessibility, and they're not going to care whether or not the other parts of the organization tie into the part that they are tasked with building. So, the way we solve this problem is that I am actually embedded on each team's project with each of the multiple vendors on each of the systems that we're rebuilding. And one of the things that we can do is that every vertical within the Wildlife and Fisheries Agency will see a similar UX, a similar process flow, similar UI conventions, and they'll still see their own branding applied to Pelican, as Keisha and James have mentioned. That gives Wildlife and Fisheries an immediate sense of ownership, like, yes, this is mine, this is ours. Our money is well spent with the Office of Technology Services. Second lesson that we've learned in all of this is all of these isolated systems lead to duplicated and often inaccurate data. I'm going to tell you a quick story. Imagine this scenario. You want to get a fishing license. Well, last year you went to one kind of outdoor store. This year you go to a different merchant to get your fishing license. What if this year you discovered you couldn't buy the license because you were already on record for having bought the license already, even though you did? Now, I've simplified some of the things here, but things like this have happened because each merchant didn't quite follow the specs that the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries needed. And because they did that, we now have multiple John Smiths, some with an H and some without an H. So what do we do with this? We've learned that all of these isolated systems and duplicated data are going to lead to problems. So, what we did is we worked with the Wildlife and Fisheries, and we found some gold nuggets inside of the trash. The dirty data. When John Smith appears multiple times, in some records, John Smith appears as what's called a lifetime license holder. That means John Smith literally walked to the office, showed up in person, had multiple forms of identification, and he's on record as the canonical John Smith. Working through all this data and matching it all together, we're creating something called a customer record. And we're going to get a golden record of customers that we're going to extend to some of our oyster fishermen, which I'll tell you about next. I hang up too fast. No, I did not. Okay. Finally, the third lesson that we learned is everything that we build for them ultimately has to have financial reporting, especially with the Department of Revenue. Currently, with the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries hands is a bunch of spreadsheets on a bunch of local machines that they email to each other. We've all seen this before. Well, every system that we build, we know has more. One of the metrics that we know is that it has to talk to not only the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries central revenue system, but also the Louisiana Department of Revenue system. So you could say that the buck stops here. You get it? Deer, dollars? Yeah. Y'all love that, though. Pretend you didn't. And because it all has to be reported there, this is where everything ties in together. Now, what do all these lessons mean for y'all? Now, I realize y'all don't work for the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, but we talk about serving the people. But for an organization, for an agency like ours, We serve the other agencies within Louisiana by building them good systems. And as Keisha was just talking about adding those little touches that people need for their buttons to always be there, that's because what if the vendor was truly thinking about all of you in addition to your constituents? Wouldn't you like that vendor just a little bit more? Would you be a little more forgiving of their errors? That's actually usually the case. So, of all the lessons that we've learned that cohesion on all of the systems requires vigilance, because many vendors don't care. Not all. I'm sure there's some who do. In fact, one of the vendors we're working with right now, I'm convinced, probably gives a damn more than all the other vendors I've ever worked with. Also, when we have these isolated systems, we're going to have duplicate data, and duplicate data is dirty data that's unreliable. And then everything is finally reported to the Department of Revenue. We all know roads don't magically make themselves, but we know we need this revenue to fund the work of ecologists, biologists, policymakers. One of the things that Wildlife and Fisheries does is they track all the deer in the state, even down to knowing how many bucks and does are actually within each of the deer regions of the state, down to like statistical accepted statistical error rates. Something about deer is that deer will eat a lot of different plants, but there's some plants that they like more than others. The plants that they really like to eat are called indicator species. But when the deer start eating plants they don't like, the biologists know that there's a problem. Maybe there's too many deer. Maybe there's some nutritional deficiencies in the species of plants that the deer do like. Well, what if I told you that UX disasters in government software is kind of like deer having to eat what's there and not what they like? Another show of hands. How many of you can think of a piece of software that you have to use in your job that you think sucks? SAP, anyone? Oh, am I not supposed to say that? Okay. When you're using software that you just have to use because it's there, and you don't like it, that's like deer eating the plants they don't like. Well, to us, we know that signals a problem. We think it's important to consider the government workers' experience in their day-to-day jobs as well as those of our constituents. And you know what? At the end of the day, when you go home, you're not going to be thinking so much about, oh, I hated pushing that button today, I hate SAP. I mean, I'm not supposed to say that, right? You're going to think, okay, well, today was rough because of these other things, but not because the technology people didn't consider my workload. With that, I'm going to hand this back to James Hall.
I'll use this one. So, yeah, going forward, as we move forward, we're focusing on continuing to scale what's working for us. Trying to create sustainable processes for long-term improvement. Applying the lessons that we learned from every project, all the early projects, Israel's puns, and and whether or not they were successful. And the goal isn't just to modernize systems, but to modernize how we think about building software in government. Now we're going to do awkward handoffs.
Oh, yeah, I'll sit here and say what I was going to say. So, regarding sustainable processes, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of what we did, is this here, come on? Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sounds so different from over here. So a lot of what we achieved from the EPSM project and projects that we have going on right now, what we find is that we're able to reuse so many things. And like I said, if it's not broke, don't fix it, but also if it's working, you can fix a lot of other things with it. And so there are custom components that we can roll into Pelican, or there are templates that we've built out that allow us to create a skeleton for an API, a UI, an identity server, a monolith. within minutes. And it's already tied to the way that we use our workflow and the way that we tend to build apps. And so as we go forward, building these apps out day to day, we're finding ways that things that work and things that we think will continue to work. And I think that's very important as we're talking about this concept of modernization, because time just keeps going. So the apps that we're building today that are newfangled, shiny, and great, they're gonna be old in a little bit. So it's good to have that mindset of constantly rolling in the new thing and constantly improving incrementally, and not necessarily trying to just, switch out from one moment to the next.
We think that accessibility is an obligation to society. We were doing the accessibility efforts. We were testing things with screen readers, learning how to use screen readers on our phones, on Windows, and on the Mac OS, even before we knew that Title II was coming down. One of the great successes that we've had there is, since Title II came down though, because now we have an extra hammer in case we meet resistance, and that's my favorite metaphor, because sometimes a process or a mindset is so intractable, there's no adaptation, there's only destruction. In the Wildlife and Fisheries Project, we actually have hints on many of the screens of how voice operating users can invoke the individual buttons, and sitting in with stakeholders when they review mock-ups with us. In some mock-ups, I had this tiny pink dash at the top of the mock-up, and I tell the stakeholders, this is our reminder to talk with the developers for how we implement things for something called live regions for screen readers. We've incorporated shift left, an industry term of thinking about accessibility at the beginning of the process for a while now, and we're still learning. We're even putting all of our developers and designers into technical accessibility training from well-known names in the space, and we're learning to do these things. And even if something happens in the future, each of us who is in this room who likes technology, we're all going to be old soon, or we're all going to have some sort of thing that hinders us from using our favorite devices the way we're used to now. We may come to rely on more voice control. We may need to increase the text size. We may lose some of our visual acuity. At the worst, I'm at least building systems that I know I will be able to use as I become, the grandpa who's trying not to be the one who doesn't know how to use his device.
And so just kind of hopefully wrap this up for you. Delivery isn't just about code, it's about the people. Keeping those stakeholders engaged, showing the progress early and often, celebrating all the little wins, and communicating clearly. It's all just as important as the technology itself. And so using these lessons, basically every project you do, take something out of it, use it to get better. Key takeaways: start small, show value early, build momentum, make accessibility and equity a part of the foundation, not something that gets bolted on later. Lean into collaboration with your teams, with your stakeholders, because nobody can do it alone. And for us, all of our progress has come from breaking down those silos and working together with our agencies, getting in there, hands-on, learning the domain each time, and getting deep. So we'll hopefully be able to answer some questions here. We made a simple little landing page that links to our design system, our accessibility nodes. Like I said, we cover 16 different agencies, and so there's probably lots of things we couldn't touch on today, but feel free to reach out to us. I've got cards up here if you want. We're happy to talk more with you. So,
I'd like to make a note about the design system. It is open source. There is a Figma file as well as GitHub pages. Feel free to download these, and if you go to hello.ogs.la.gov, if ever When you decide to download it and you have an idea to make it better or a question, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be reaching out to other people who have been coming here, so we want to give back.
Do you all have any questions for us?
All right, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really great. I'm Denise Ross. I worked in the IT department in the city of New Orleans after Katrina. And I will say when I came into city government, I was struck by how these layers of incompletely implemented systems had made our recovery so much harder. And I'm just like so proud of the progress you all have made at the state level. And I'd love to hear more about how this enterprise approach is making, like the successes you're having in terms of resilience, especially when you've got severe storms or whatnot coming your way. Like, how are you more agile nowadays that your ducks are in a row?
Having that enterprise view, it's definitely helped a lot. We've been able to identify, hey, what are the key, when we're doing our disaster recovery plan, what are the key systems, not just from I guess like a cybersecurity event is going to be a lot different than a hurricane. So what's the priority in each of those situations? So with a hurricane, okay, these are the ones we need to get up and make sure they're available. Citizen single sign-on, our benefits programs, any of the information site. Thankfully, a lot of times with hurricanes coming, you have a little bit of warning, except for those random ones that like to just form in the Gulf. So we can actually start to push things up to the cloud out of our data centers if need be, and that way they hopefully stay up and stay more available during that time. So hopefully just getting better each and every time we have one of those.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jenny. I work for the state of Maryland, and I'm incredibly envious of everything you just presented. And I also missed the first 5 minutes, so I apologize if you talked about this at the beginning.
Those were the best 5 minutes of the whole
I can only imagine how good they were then, because this was really great, and I'm sad that it's the last session of the conference. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit nitty-gritty on how you built these things. Are they customized cots, rebuilding from scratch? Are they vendor development teams or in-house development teams? How big were your teams? How long did it take? Because I can't imagine building anything like this in Maryland right now, but we'd like to get there.
Yeah, so as we got more and more into agile software development, we switched primarily to doing staff aug for most of our projects. So we try to inject key state resources onto every project, development resources, obviously SMEs from the agency as well. But we're, for all the ones that we showed here, they were custom development projects. And so we're bringing in those resources. I typically try to pick resources that we can learn from and help ourselves get better. Like, what are our weaknesses? Usually in state government, it's some of those higher level developers that they've either moved on or we just haven't been able to grow that talent. So bringing those that can train and mentor, and those are key features of those people that we're looking for when we're doing those interview processes, so that we can hopefully grow our staff out of it and continue to build and support these. I felt like there was 20 questions in there, so.
How big were your teams?
Oh yeah, so typically our teams are between like 5 and 10 people. Some of the bigger projects like motor vehicles had 2 or 3 of those teams where we were able to break up and hopefully not run over each other. I think our project for Department of Corrections has 2 teams going. And then, where it makes sense, we try to also staff some of our projects completely ourselves. And a lot of it depends on the different agencies and how they're funded and what they're, able to, what they can afford. So.
My questions are, it's just
It's okay.
piggybacks off of hers, but I'm curious, like, so that you just described? Is it like, how many engineers, a product owner, a designer, like? how
Yeah,
many?
yeah. So it depends, but we try to keep, I guess maybe just a basic ratio of for every 3 developers, 1 QA, 1 business analyst, and kind of use that as the model, and partially using the budget to decide, whether it's 1 or 2 of those pods. Then we'll typically bring in a scrum master. We usually also supply the project manager and separate, those roles a bit. Trying to think, and then a designer. We more or less force a designer on every project, and it has paid huge dividends. Unfortunately, our designers are strapped and working pretty thin now. So trying to hopefully expand that team. So, up in the front.
Hi, Laurel Rogers. I work at Okta. I live in Maryland, but I actually went to LSU, so big fan of Louisiana. My question, and I'll frame it in 2 ways because I don't know, like, if it's too spicy or not. But if these 3 initiatives were done today during, the current like cost savings and efficiencies mandates that are going on. Going back to the marketing part that you talked about, like having to market the justification of these projects, would there be anything you have to change on your justification to get these approved, even though they're custom developed? And then if you can't answer in that capacity, then the other way is how has the success of these 3 initiatives helped you justify projects that are happening right now during the same time?
Before you answer that, can we say, yay, LSU?
Yeah, we're in a rain delay right now. So for some reason we seem to get a lot of buy-in on custom development, and it does seem weird. It feels like a lot of times there's not something off the shelf, so we do typically try and look for something off the shelf that will work, and it inevitably, it's missing too many things, and customizing anything off the shelf is a recipe for disaster that we've seen too many times. The success of these projects, it has, and I feel like I heard this in an earlier session where we're paying for that success now, where we're stretched pretty thin trying to figure out which ones we can do, but we're getting better at, I think, splitting our resources, finding ways to be strategic about, having the key people on the project so that we get the knowledge that we need. I think there's a very big desire right now in the state of Louisiana for modernizing these systems. The 50-year-old mainframe being in the news every other week has helped shine a light on, hey, maybe there needs to be some more investment in technology. So I think maybe we've been a little bit lucky in that, and I wish that luck upon you all as far as funding goes. So.
I'd like to add to your question and to your question in 2 ways, actually. Actually, in one way, that if you find yourself strapped at the beginning for justifying, say, the need for the project, but there's a problem, if you can find a way to get a designer on board with you somehow and begin converting the problem into some of, like what we showed you earlier, these mock-ups, then the stakeholders and the people who live in the problem space begin to see what could be a potential solution to their problem, and then what automatically happens, and I've done this for myself before. At one point when I was a self-employed freelancer, I would intentionally misspell certain words that I knew the customer would key in on, because once they do that, they're already starting to play a part in there, and then they've already exerted some effort. And this is why platforms like LinkedIn will tell you, hey, your profile is 80% done, you should finish it. Because once people feel like they've invested some energy into something, they're gonna keep going with it. And that's why Meta does this sort of stuff to us. So if you can get a designer in to make the problem visual, or rather, to make the solution to the problem visual, you will make their brain start to play along with that. And you'll know you have success when they're ready to start talking about, okay, well, how do we make this work?
And to go back to the team composition one, something you said, just, that we didn't cover here. Usually when we're starting a project, we try and jump in with either an architect or a lead developer, a designer, and a business analyst. And we bring those three in from the get-go. And so the business analyst is starting to get those requirements. The architect or the lead developer can start laying the groundwork, and the designer is showing progress. They're the ones that get the stakeholders excited. But that lets us, whenever we bring the full team on, especially with the developers, nobody wants to pay for a developer that's just sitting around. So they're able to get going and writing code and providing value immediately. So staggering the rollout of the team helps a lot for us. All right, any other questions? Well then, thank you all for coming. This has been a great summit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, Laurel. Nice to meet you. Yeah, of course.